Welcome everyone to our virtual 2020 PWS Family Conference presented by Levo Therapeutics. Before we begin today's presentation, let's first thank our amazing sponsors, Levo Therapeutics, Soleno Therapeutics, Harmony Biosciences, Rhythm Pharmaceuticals, Saniona, and Novo Nordisk. Their support allowed us to make this conference free for all our community members, and we are incredibly grateful for their contributions. In today's session, Improving Social Functioning, Elizabeth Roof will provide a brief overview of social functioning and ideas for how to work on these skills at home. Elizabeth Roof is a senior research specialist at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, coordinating multiple research programs with children and adults with Prader-Willi syndrome. Her areas of interest are a whole person approach to mental health management and prevention of psychiatric and behavior problems in PWS. Since 1995, she has personally evaluated more than 325 individuals with PWS and has given feedback on issues such as family and school interventions, medical recommendations, and residential placement. Without further ado, I welcome Elizabeth Roof.
Thanks, everybody. I'm so excited to be here and doing a virtual session with everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about social skills and Prader-Willi syndrome, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know, how we know it, and then this idea of what you can do at home. I think it's way harder now that everyone is virtual trying to figure out how to deal with social skills, but I'm going to talk about some things that we learned doing it exactly that way. So I'm actually at Vanderbilt University, and we actually have several studies, several clinical trials going on currently with people with PWS. And through the generous funding of FPWR, finished a study looking specifically at building social skills for people with PWS called the BOSS study. So what do we know about social skills in people with PWS? What we kind of started with was this idea of we try to figure out things that people with PWS were interested in, right? So generally what we find, having done this for 25 years, is that people with PWS are very interested in animals. Pets are a big thing for them. They really like seeing their animals, their pets. They are very kind and generous and loving. And the other thing we know is they like working together, like doing puzzles, things like that. And so this idea is can we take things that they like doing and can we find a way for those to be building social skills on those things? So a lot of people have very preconceived notions about PWS. And so some of the things that people have said over the years is that they all have autism. Well, they don't. Only about 12% of our sample actually had a true ASD diagnosis, and it's much lower than earlier reports. That they're only interested in food, that's the only thing that motivates them. And again, not true. They're often very socially motivated and they want friends. We hear often that that is something that people with PWS crave: relationships, friendships, romantic relationships. All those things are things that people with PWS really, really want. And that they're not, some people say they're not interested in other people. Again, definitely not true. Or they can't have normal social interactions because of food, because of all the limitations with food. But we find that many parents find ways for their kids to socialize even with food issues. So the deal is you have to be creative, but they can do most social activities. They can participate in parties, dances, sleepovers. You just have to find ways to kind of manage and supervise the food issues, but it shouldn't preclude them from social activities. It's so important. It's funny, I was just on a call earlier this morning thinking that social connectedness and relationships are one of the most important parts of being a human. And they're way more important sometimes than academics, which we spend a lot of time talking about. But in order to have a good quality life, you need friendships and you need social interaction. So the poll is going to be, I think this is a great idea to kind of connect people with the idea is how many people have ever wondered whether their child might have the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder? So if you've ever wondered that, go ahead and take the poll. So yes or no. We find, again, it's 12% of the folks who actually have that diagnosis. And we actually did a very specific assessment to do that called the ADOS, but found that a lot of people do have some of the social deficits associated with autism. They just don't necessarily meet criteria for it. So hopefully you're answering right now, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we've got a couple more polls coming up. So I'm excited. Like I said, I think this is a great way for parents to be able to connect with the talk and be able to put input in. So it's about a little more than half. So 56% have actually worried about that, and 44% have not. And so again, I think there are definitely more people who worry about that than who actually have it. But I think it's important to actually get the diagnosis so that you can maybe get those extra services you might need, like ABA. And as we continue on, what we ended up doing and trying to look at social skills specifically is looking at things, emotional recognition. So basically there's this test that has 7 universal like kinds of faces. And so basically the facial expressions you see there are fear, anger, happy, sad, disgust, surprise. Disgust shouldn't be there twice. I think it's contempt. But anyway, we found that these are standardized across all cultures. So all cultures recognize what these faces are kind of showing you. And then we also did something called social perception. It was a vignettes task. They basically watched a little video of kids about their age doing these kinds of short social interactions. I want to talk a little bit about what those look like, because what we wanted to see is, could people with PWS understand what was going on socially, and then what were the intentions behind the person who did something. So basically, were they trying to be mean? Were they trying to be nice? Were they being a good friend? Those kinds of things. And so we administered it to 94 children, youth, and adults with PWS at 2 time points. And what we found is that everyone recognized happy, but what about the other emotions? So fear, only about 30 to 60% of kids and adults with PWS recognize fear over chance levels. So the idea is that they don't look at necessarily a person who's kind of showing a scared face as necessarily being scared. That's problematic if you don't actually get how people are feeling, right? If someone's scared, you may misinterpret that reaction to another emotion. So again, only 30 to 60%. And the next emotion would be sad. Again, only 50 to 60% of kids and adults with PWS recognize sad over chance levels. So again, they're not always aware of what people are feeling. But 80% of the folks recognize anger, right? This has to sound familiar. Why are you yelling at me? Why are you mad at me? You're mad at me all the time. I said I didn't do it. Why are you mad at me? But that face of anger is something that 80% of our folks recognize right off the bat. And what we think is that because the idea of anger being a really significant emotion for them, it's really important for them to get anger, right? And it's often the emotion that people with PWS display. They often seem like, if you know what they're feeling, it's feeling anger. The next poll is, which emotion is hardest for your child to recognize in others? Is it happy, sad, angry, or scared? And so again, is your kid tuned into how other people are feeling, and are they negative emotions, or are they more positive emotions? So again, answer the poll, see what you think, and what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what those emotions may be telling us more about social interactions with people with PWS. So at this point, we should be getting some results fairly quickly. And we'll talk a little bit about, again, the specific emotions that we found for people with PWS. Well, look at that. This is really interesting. So again, makes perfect sense that happy, everybody gets that. Sad, a third of the folks have a harder time recognize that. Angry, 10%, which is what we would expect to see. Scared, right? So scared is one that I think a lot of people with PWS don't get. And so for parents, when sometimes we're scared about our kids' safety, they take that as angry, right? They're like, you're mad at me. I'm like, no, I was freaking out that you were going to get hurt. So it's really interesting to see that this really kind of follows along with what we have found in our research of people kind of face to face with PWS. So what we found is that generally people with PWS did pretty well making correct calls. They could actually point out and find out lying, people who were trying to trick them, deception, and rejection. So they got the gist of these kinds of social stories pretty easily. But what they didn't understand is the sincere kind of accidents of others. There is one where there's a girl in a hallway. She is carrying a big stack of papers, and another girl in the hallway putting on her book bag, not looking, slings her book bag, hits the girl's papers and they knock all out of her hand. And so people with PWS said almost universally that the person slinging the backpack was trying to be mean to the other girl. Though she apologized, she helped her pick them up, and she said several times, "I'm sorry, I didn't see you." People with PWS didn't get that. They just kept saying she was trying to be mean. And when you try to lead them to that natural assumption of sometimes people have accidents, sometimes we're not, paying attention, sometimes things happen, they didn't get that. They really often feel that people's intentions are much more negative and personal than other folks, right? So we don't always think that when somebody cuts us off in traffic, they're doing that to us personally. Sometimes we feel that way. But this idea is that they think often that it's being done to them. So I think it's interesting to kind of see that we have to kind of understand how they see the world, and that we also found that these didn't generally get better over time. Adults weren't necessarily better than kids at being able to do these kinds of tasks. And so this idea is that they have a very different lens at how they see the world. So what we found is that they did better in kind of sincere scenarios, so when things are pretty straightforward, direct, involving a stronger emotional exchange. So what we kind of have found is that they might need stronger emotional expressions to correctly interpret social interactions. And so when you see people's faces being angry, you can pretty well guess how people are feeling, or if it's a really strong kind of like tone of voice, facial expression. And I know for us, what we do is we actually kind of almost over animate our faces. So if we're excited, we're really excited. And if we're sad, we have to really show them. So I think it's important for people to realize that if you have kind of a more subtle expression, you might need to ramp it up a little bit for your kid to understand how you're feeling and what's going on. I think it's also really important to get that you can't learn new skills without opportunities. This idea is that you can't live in a vacuum and surround yourself in a bubble and get social interaction. So when I ask people often, like, about their kids' social skills, and they're like, well, they're not very good. They don't have many friends. People don't invite them anywhere. Basically they go to school, they come home, and that would be their, extent of their social interaction. If I talk to kids with PWS, they're like, oh my gosh, I have so many friends. They'll name every single kid in their classroom, some kid who walked down the street, it doesn't matter. To them, they're all considered friends, right? But you can't get new skills and you can't get better at something unless you do something. So it's really important to kind of get out there, be a part of something, adapt, and don't hide. Your kid may not be good at it. It doesn't matter. We find that the more social opportunities that you take part of, the better your social skills get. So do parents need to support it? Sure. Do you may need to find some accommodations? Absolutely. But don't think to yourself, my kid can't do it. So if people aren't making play dates, keeping play dates, I have people now trying to set up Zoom play dates, whatever it takes, you're going to have to kind of help push your kid out there, because they won't learn those new skills without a lot of opportunity and a lot of kind of concrete supports. And we're going to talk about the supports in a little bit, because I think it's important for parents to know kind of how to meet their kid and really help them adapt those kinds of social skills to people with PWS. So can we teach social skills? For a while, it was really not sure that we could. So we had to figure out what skills they start out with and how to build up on them. We have to teach them in small chunks and make them concrete. Then we have to find ways for them to practice in groups and on their own. And then we need to find a way to include as many people as we can. So that's kind of what we started out with. And so that's where we actually started out with. The next slide is going to be the BOSS study. So the BOSS study basically looked at taking strengths and turning them into skills. So individual interests can be a great starting point. We need to get them to focus on the right things. We need to get them to work on social skills from their perspective. We can't expect them to be from our perspective. They need to be thinking about how they see the world. And we needed to break them down into tasks, into small parts. We need to model and practice and practice and practice. What we found is that I started out with this curriculum that I, basically kind of wrote from scratch. I was so excited. We did like 4 sessions and they were a disaster. I started too far in the kind of future, so that I didn't think about the skills that they didn't have to begin with. And so we found that we had to start at the very beginning, just like Maria Von Trapp, right? You have to start at the very beginning, figure out what they know, and at that point we could build skills. But we could not think that they understood things from a developmental perspective or from our perspective, just because we found out that they didn't get some of the things we were trying to do. So the BOSS study was a 2-year study using some funding from FPWR that was so helpful. And it was ironic because it was actually way before COVID. It started in 2017, and we saw 60 people with PWS over 2 years. So it was a 10-week curriculum, 3 times a week. We had groups of 5 to 7. I think there maybe was one group with 8 people in it. And we looked at kind of everybody would log on. We had people logging on from school. We had people who went on camping trips, who were in the middle of a forest, logging on their phone. We had people who were willing to do whatever it took to be a part of it, people from even other countries. And so with time zones and everything else, we tried to make it work. Haley, who works with me, was actually, we were the 2 facilitators. And again, found out after a few sessions that we had to basically rewrite everything and started a different thing. And what we started with was facial and emotional recognition. People needed to look at a face and understand what they needed to look at. And so what we found is that a lot of folks with PWS, and this is actually from some of our ERP studies, that's an EEG kind of like thing, is that people with PWS, when they're looking at folks, they look at the mouth. They don't look at the eyes, they don't look at the forehead, they're not looking at the right part. So what we found is if we covered parts of our faces with a piece of white paper and asked them to focus on a specific thing, they got better at figuring out what the emotion was. And so they started focusing their attention. We had one young lady who was actually had a hard time looking at people's faces, like literally made her very anxious. We actually went from the very beginning, and for 5 minutes before the Zoom sessions would start, we would talk to her one-on-one to kind of warm her up for the group. And then I just would watch her face, and she got better and better every session at looking at people's faces while they were talking, listening to the tone of their voice, reading their body language, all those things she got better at because we kind of primed her to get ready for a small group of people and then a bigger group of people. So what we did first is kind of like looking at an example of kind of how do you identify emotions. We talked about being relaxed. We focus a lot on being relaxed but alert, right? So this idea is that we want them paying attention. I had some kid who kept spinning around in the chair, like we couldn't see him. I'm like, man, stop doing that. But we wanted them to be relaxed. So we used to do some deep breathing. We do a little stretching. And then we would say, let's look at the eye area. What do you think they're feeling? And we, even if they were wrong, like patently wrong, we would go, huh, okay, I can kind of see that. But it looks like they might be more likely to be sad, right? And be like, oh yeah, I see that. So we really tried really hard. Now look at the mouth. Does that seem like it's the same as the eyes? Do those match up? What do you think happened to make them feel that way? So we would often put them, you put yourself in their shoes. What do you think happened? And it's interesting, when you're sad, we would hear often what makes people with PWS feel sad. Can you tell me a time that you felt that way? What happened? What did you do? What are the possible ways that you could respond to that emotion? And then again, we started with still pictures that were actually not, there were people's faces, but they weren't moving. And then we moved towards movie clips. And then we would actually, Haley and I would act out the different roles. And then we moved from the people in the group actually acting out the different roles. It was kind of like still picture, movie, real people that there weren't them, and then them. And so this idea is we really kind of slowly progressed to that. And lots of practice, lots of praise. You have to keep saying, that makes a lot of sense. I love how you said that. So you have to constantly praise those kinds of, even when you get close, even if you make an effort, praise them, because they need to know that they're doing okay and that you're really proud of them. So interacting effectively. So what we found is that people with PWS are so into their own kind of like thoughts, feelings, restricted interests, that they're not listening to other people. Haley really put it perfectly. She said, the first thing we had to teach people is there are other people and they matter. So this idea that I may be interested in something that's very important to me and I can talk about it, but if you're not interested in that thing, it's really hard for us to have a relationship or a conversation. So it was important for them to listen to other people and to watch for clues. People's tones of voices, their body language, what are those other things telling you? And what we had to do is specifically have them focus on a tone of voice without a face without a tone, all those things. What we find is that there's so much going on for people with PWS, they don't know where to look, right? They're just kind of like, oh, wow, there's so much going on. And then what we did is said that once they heard it, you're going to listen and then respond with a comment or question that was appropriate. So if somebody says, hey, how are you? And you say, how are you? I would sometimes say that's not appropriate. They're asking you how you are. So you say, answer that question, and then you can say, I'm doing great. How about you? So we had to focus on that. Think about what's important to them and then ask a question about that thing. We talked a lot about it like throwing a ball. The more you do it, the better you get. So conversations were throwing a ball to the other person, and you can literally do this to teach social skills. You can use a ball, and if you're holding the ball, you can ask a question or say a thing, and then you can't until you're holding the ball. So you throw the ball to the other person and have them answer. It was really important for them to learn things like turn taking and not interrupting. People with PWS love to interrupt. They're interested in their stuff and they don't really care what you have to say. So we really focused a lot on those kinds of things. And if you mess up, try again. Rote conversations initially are totally okay because they give you skills. And then once you get the hang of it, we want to build up speed and complexity. And then we wanted them to actually self-evaluate and work on those skills. So we would have them do homework assignments. So if we were talking about emotions, we would have them go around the house that they lived in or with classmates or whatever, and they would be a detective. They would focus on what the person was feeling, why they might be feeling that, and then they would confirm with the person. So it seems to me you're feeling frustrated or angry. Yes, I was. Can you tell me about that? So we had them do those things, and it was really fun because they love knowing how other people were feeling. And what we realized is that we think they know that stuff. They don't. And what we found is that people with PWS have a much harder time learning from watching other people's interactions than we do. For typical kids, we learn a lot by watching other people. Oh, well, they crashed and burned. Don't want to do that thing. People with PWS don't see that. So we had to make them responsible and do the homework at home so that they could practice those skills. So handling conflicts, people with PWS often get into conflicts, right? So what we found is that we would focus on emotions first, how people are feeling, and then the situation that would make people feel that way. Then we would have them put themselves in somebody else's shoes, and then finding ways to talk it out. So we would often, Haley and I would have these conflicts where we'd be very upset with each other about something that happened in the lab, right? And we would have them pretend to, be me or Haley. And it was really fun to watch how apparently very dramatic Haley and I both are. We yell at each other, we hurl insults, but it was really cool to watch them go through all the steps and then get to talking it out. How can you come up with a compromise? How can you find a way to kind of get your point across without being argumentative? So we talked about how to make a point, how to listen to others. And then the most important part was, how do we solve a problem? It's not about being right. It's not about being wrong. It's coming to some kind of way of compromising. And if we mess up, can we move past it? We talked a lot about forgiving and forgetting. People with PWS, they may forgive, but they don't ever forget, right? They'll bring it up as soon as they get a chance. But we talked about how important it was for us to be able to forgive others and to forgive ourselves when we mess up and be able to move on. Because if we can't learn from those mistakes, it's really hard to actually put that in practice. And again, we talked a lot about practice and praise and hitting the street with new skills. We would actually have them talk about conflicts they had at school. They would pass the question around the group. So how do you think I should handle it? What do you think I should do? We had a young man who had an argument actually on camera in Zoom with a family member who was unloading the dishwasher. He got very upset about that because he was supposed to be in a quiet place. He was doing his best. She was unloading the dishwasher and he kept asking her to stop. And finally he got very angry and started yelling. We actually, the next session, problem solved what he could have done differently. And I was so impressed because we didn't even have to problem solve. He even said, well, I've told her that while I'm doing my Zoom boss sessions that I really need privacy and I need quiet so that I can focus on the other people in the group. And I was like, wow, okay, we're getting somewhere, people. So handling conflicts is so very important. And it's just an incredible thing for people with PWS. And we saw so much change in those things. So what we found is that we all need ways to stay connected and combat loneliness. So, again, finding ways to connect, make and keep friends are really important for people with PWS. Don't think they don't have the same wants and needs that we do. They don't have them in quite the same way or with the same intensity. So when parents often tell me, well, my kid is not, they don't have confidants or they don't have people that they, confide in or whatever else. It seems to be pretty superficial. I'm like, right, but does your kid say that they're happy, they have friends and they feel connected? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay. So they're not our friendships, they're their friendships. What they might need is a little bit different than ours. And one of the things that we did towards the very end of Boss, after 10 weeks, is we had a whole session on hopes and dreams. And they ran their own session. They talked about what their hopes and dreams were, what they wanted in their kind of life. And it was the coolest thing to see how they could see their life, what they wanted, what their like kind of hopes and dreams were. Some of them weren't all that realistic, but what I love is they connected in a way. And several people actually commented on other people's hopes and dreams in a way that was so appropriate. Like, wow, I've never thought about doing that. That sounds like that would be a really cool thing to do. Are you worried about this thing happening? And I was like, what? I mean, it was so cool to watch people connect in that way and think about the future in a very hopeful way. So the next poll is do you feel like your child has good connections with others? So, no, you're kind of concerned about that. Yes, better with family, better with teachers, or better with friends. Most people with PWS gravitate towards one of two groups: adults who basically let them get away with a lot, or very younger kids who let them boss them around. So what do you think about your kid? Do they have good connections? Are you satisfied with them? Or are they things that you feel like you would like? You're okay with family, but not so good with friends. So answer the poll, see what you think. And we will find out shortly what the answer is. So I'm kind of interested to hear about what people think in this group. Melissa is running my slides and this, so she is doing double duty. Okay, makes sense. So a lot of people, not a lot of people, I guess, think their kid have good connections. So no is pretty low. Better with family, makes sense to me. Better with teachers, again, pretty high number. Better with friends. So again, family seems to be the number one kind of source of social support. So if that is true, I think it's important to use that as a springboard to find other connections with other people that are not your family, right? So it's good that you have siblings. That's a great way to learn social skills. Siblings don't let you get away with crap that other people would. So it's very important to have siblings who go, that's stupid, or why would you do that, or whatever else. But it's important to use those as a springboard with other people. So what we found is that the boss group that ran for, like I said, 60 people over 2 years, each session, it was actually ended up being 8 groups of, or maybe 9 groups of people with PWS. It was first us, and then we started actually training graduate students to do it. So graduate special ed students would do it. They did a fantastic job. Actually, probably at the end, were way better than we were. And what we found is that people with PWS definitely got better. So as far as social responsiveness, the idea that you respond appropriately to social like interactions and friendships and whatever else, things like social communication, social cognition, awareness of others, motivation, and repetitive behaviors all got better. And so child behavior checklists, or things more like maladaptive and adaptive behaviors, we found that anxiety and depression and anxiety withdrawal and somatic complaints went down. And aggression, noncompliance, and other kinds of thought, tension, and social problems all went down as well. We saw significant changes. But even more cool is parents reported, my kid actually is interacting with people so much more appropriately. They're initiating interactions, they're negotiating interactions, and they're finding ways to actually be more social. So that to me is kind of the proof is in the pudding, right? Is people were actually able to make more friends. So what we found again are those significant improvements in social functioning. And when you think about social awareness and communication, it's the ability to communicate your thoughts, feelings, but also to understand other people's thoughts and feelings. And again, we would sometimes get stuck on some of those things where people would really struggle to understand other people's motivations. And we had a young lady who was, we had rules in Boss, right? So we had rules that we had to follow and people had to do. We had a young lady who kept asking questions of others that they said they weren't comfortable answering, right? They were too intrusive. They were too whatever. She wanted to know about somebody's hot girlfriend, and he didn't want to answer about that question. So we talked a little bit about, and when I asked her, I said, so I have to ask, I said, he's told you he doesn't want to answer the question. You won't stop. I said, why? And she said, well, I really want to know. And what we found is that people with PWS sometimes get really stuck on what they want to know without this idea of compromise. And so what we talked about is that we can't always have our needs met unless we can meet someone halfway. So this idea is that we need to think about, what other people want out of a social interaction. And so, you know, people with PWS often use social interactions like an interrogation system. Do you have a pet? What's the pet's name? What color's your pet? I have a collar? What color's your collar? They just go on and on. It's like yes or no, right? I tell people all the time, relationships are like sharing. If you're going to share something, you need to be able to kind of think about how you would feel if someone did that to you. And so my thought is we really tried hard to get them to put themselves in other people's shoes. And what we found is that things like anxiety and depression, but even more important, aggression went down significantly. It's almost like a competing behavior. It's hard to be aggressive when you're actually getting your social needs met. So what we need to really think about is, are we meeting people's social needs so that things like aggression and other ways of kind of, to me, forms of communication don't need to actually happen? We also found that these improvements sustained over time. They appeared to level out 1 to 3 months post-treatment. We didn't really measure it after that, but what was really cool is we ended up doing some Zoom sessions maybe a year or so after BOSS with several of the folks actually about what it was like to have PWS. It was night and day how much better they communicated their thoughts, feelings appropriately than they did before they started BOSS. I'm not saying it's all BOSS, but this idea is that if we can find ways for them to connect, we can actually help them be able to better communicate their thoughts and feelings to others instead of having to act out to get their needs met. So what we see in the sessions, we definitely see improvements in listening, people being able to take turns. And I will say that we had to be pretty tough. Our graduate students sometimes thought we were a little bit mean. If I had somebody who continued to interrupt and we continued to redirect, I would just cut them off Zoom. They were gone. We bring them back the next session. They did it again, gone. This idea is they have to have consequences. So again, they needed to be responding appropriately and be on topic. They needed to take turns. We had one young man who kept in Zoom kept chatting because no one would let him talk. I said, that's not okay, people. If he has to do that to communicate with you guys, then you're not giving him a turn to talk. They needed to show compliance with group rules. One of the rules was you couldn't eat on camera. We had somebody who actually had 2 lollipops, one in each hand. She was literally in, and the kids were just freaking out. And it was like, so we had to actually get her off of Zoom. So you had to follow the rules. You had to get along. And what we found is that people with PWS were so willing to follow the rules to get their social needs met. That is incredibly huge. So again, we found that level of insight improved, and reflecting on others' input. I love the fact that even when people would say sometimes kind of ridiculous things, they would be like, so you want to grow up and be a chef in a restaurant? Okay, I mean, that would be a really cool job. Are you worried about the food? I mean, are you worried about, like, you know, having all that food there? I mean, what an incredibly diplomatic way to say it versus, what's wrong with you? You have Prader-Willi syndrome. You can never be a chef. They were so diplomatic. It was incredible. And again, the cognitive level, the developmental level, everything was so diverse. It wasn't just like the smartest kids said these things. We had kids who were so good at reading the emotions and thoughts and feelings of others. It is incredible to think about how much they were willing to pay attention to other people's thoughts and feelings. So again, those are kinds of things we saw in sessions. The real benefits of BOSS to me were the fact that people still stayed in touch with their friends from 2017. We had people that as soon as BOSS ended, they were like, okay, we don't like this. We don't want it to be over. So we did 3 booster sessions for each BOSS session. We did that for the first month, the 3rd month, and the 6th month, just to kind of have people check in. And they kept saying, it's not enough, Elizabeth, it's not enough. So they would talk about homework and classes and boys and whatever else. They would play virtual games online. They would do puzzles online. We had a couple people who've developed relationships. We even have somebody who got engaged after BOSS. And so, like, the reality is when they have the peer group that is actually like them, they can actually form really meaningful, significant relationships. And what was really cool is I love the fact that when we get on these BOSS sessions, again, most of these folks didn't know each other before they started. I remember one guy goes, everybody has Prader-Willi here? I go, everybody has Prader-Willi. So this idea is they're like me. And there were 1 or 2 things that people talked about that were so sweet and so very amazing as far as they felt safe enough. I had a young man who talked about, he worked in a courthouse. His job was cleaning in a courthouse wherever he lived. And he was telling a story about one time he saw food in the trash can, and instead of throwing it into the big bin that he was cleaning out, he took the food out of the trash can, and he said, and someone saw me and they started laughing at me, and they pointed out to other people, this guy ate food out of the trash can. That's disgusting. He said it was so embarrassing. One of the girls in another group, in his group, but in another place, said, I can't believe they said that to you. You have Prader-Willi. You couldn't help it. And I thought, what an incredibly sweet thing to say. And he said, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. He goes, I've never told anybody that story because I was so embarrassed. Wow, that's real connection. And we still have several families who've stepped up and now run their own groups. And so one is under 18, one is for adults. I will say some of the caveats, since I actually put these slides together, is we actually had to shut the groups down, and we're going to actually open them up, because what we found is they still need supervision. We had some power hungry people who were kicking people off and deciding who, you know, wasn't following the rules, and some of them were pretty minor infractions. And we talked about the ideas that, you know, we probably need to still manage them. So that's something we're going to actually start back up again, actually in the next month. So be on the lookout for some things we'll post on FPWR's website that people can actually get hooked up. We have so many people who are looking for friends who have Prader-Willi syndrome, who are like that, and we want very much to be able to give them those opportunities. So we'll do that as well. I'll actually share that info. So one of the very coolest things is that we're getting ready to hopefully publish the BOSS curriculum. So the things that we use, the movie vignettes that we use, the faces, the actual kind of script that people can follow. We are actually working with 2 publishers. We're waiting for a decision from either one. One is out of the UK and one is out of the United States, trying to find a way to do that. But hopefully by the end of 2020, we'll actually have a kind of like a workbook that you can have, a disc or a downloadable kind of like a little thing of like the faces so that somebody could do it. So we're hoping that it'll be used in schools, vocational training, regional centers, any place that people with developmental disabilities need to learn social skills. So the workbook includes resources, a facilitator's guide, there's handouts for people, stimuli for the group, there's homework assignments, things like that. The facilitators can be anyone. I tell people you don't have to have any special training. It could be a teacher, it could be a social worker, a mental health worker, a trained parent. The only thing you have to have is some, to me, some kind of skills or experiences working with groups. It's really easy, and we had this with our students, where things would get out of control or there would be a problem. And usually at that point, I would get involved with either the parent or the person involved and kind of like work it out. So it's really important to have some experience working with groups so that you can kind of navigate that. We've, you know, Zoom, everyone now, back in the day, Zoom wasn't something that everyone was using. Now it is, so everyone's quite good at it. It's a really easy to use platform. It's HIPAA compliant, it's safe, it's free. And we found that virtual reality could be less threatening and distracting than in person. Because again, you have a kind of a flat background. You know, we see people doing things they weren't supposed to be doing. Like I said, spinning in their chair or walking around, petting the dog or whatever else. We would just say, hey, remember, no dogs in session. Oh, yeah, okay. Sorry, Elizabeth, I forgot about that. And we found that there were homework exercises to generalize the lesson. So we found that if we could actually help them do things in their in their own setting at home or at school or wherever they are, they could actually start to learn these lessons, not just in our group, but in all settings, because that's really what we want to do. Just like with people with autism, you don't want to say, hey, you learned this skill and now you can do it at this one place. We really want them to find ways to learn the skill, take the skill and use it in their own life in lots of different settings. So again, we don't want it to be this idea that you can only use it here because that's where we told you to use it. We want you to find new ways to use it. And for our folks that are still in some of these social groups and connecting, they are still using the skills and they're finding new ways to actually use the skills. And they're getting better for sure. Like I said, it is night and day how much better they are at navigating some of the social stuff. So things you can do at home. So again, practice taking the talking stick. So, you know, guess that emotion. How am I feeling? Focus attention to your voice, your face, your body language. Set up your own Zoom groups, play dates. Work on soothing emotions before they happen. So when things get out of control, it's a little bit like driving a car. You can steer, use gas, use brakes, or you could just crash into things and, you know, and keep moving on. It's way better to use some of those other techniques. And again, how would you feel? Ask your kid, how would you feel if that happened to you? How would you feel if this happened? You can demonstrate it with, you know, a parent, a sibling, whatever else, really doesn't matter. But this idea is that not everything has to be a curriculum. You can do real life things, finding ways to do that. And I do think the Zoom groups and the play dates are really important. So find like-minded friends. You know, you're still going to have to supervise. You're still going to have to navigate. I would love to say that they're going to be able to do it, but they won't. We've had more issues with people doing it on their own than when we ran them, because again, weeks go by, people get bored, they start to do things they know they're not really supposed to. They tell other people, hey, don't mention this to anybody. You know, we don't want anyone knowing this other stuff we're doing. So again, supervise, monitor, stay in connection. Don't think that they're going to be able to do this completely on their own, because they generally aren't. Perspective taking, you can ask your kid about a time where they felt a strong emotion like anger or sad. You can say kind of like, what would you do next? Just keep leading with questions and strong interest. So again, you want to kind of keep going, that's interesting. What do you think about that? Focus on them. People so much now are on their phones or distracted. Give all of your attention to your child for just a few minutes and ask them to do the same for you. You can often say, I can relate to when something made you feel the same way. So when your kid says they were sad or disappointed or hurt or whatever else, you can do that. You don't need to wax eloquently and talk about that a lot, but it's important for you to say that I felt like that too. Ask them how they would have felt if that happened to them. You can talk about how you dealt with it. So it's the idea of like, you know, you don't always have to hit people when you're angry. You can say with words, you really hurt my feelings. And for most people who are angry, the emotion that they're really managing is hurt. So it's important for people with PWS not to use just mad or happy, that there's a huge range of emotions, and ask them how they could make things better. So this idea that if you're starting to feel strong emotions, find ways for them to focus on problem solving and not just dealing with the emotion, right? Because it's like just those strong emotions we found could really be overwhelming. And once they get started, it's really hard to stop. So you want to find ways for them to kind of focus on something else instead of just the really strong emotions. These are some of our amazing families who have participated in BOSS and all sorts of other things. But again, without you guys participating and being a part of these things, we would never know the things that we know now and be able to kind of reach the families that we're reaching now. So again, I cannot express how much I appreciate the fact that families are willing to log in, do a thing, fill out questionnaires. I'm always so sorry. Like, sorry, there's more questionnaires. But it's really important for us to know how things are getting better if we ask those questions over and over. And again, we have some of the most amazing families and kids and adults with PWS. So again, thank you for sharing them with us, because without you guys, we really couldn't do it.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. What a great talk. I was taking lots of notes while doing the PowerPoint.
Good.
Absorb. So we have some great questions. So I thought we would get started on the Q&A portion. And if people have questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom and the control panel. That's where I will be looking for them. So the first question is, are the results of the emotion recognition for PWS different than the general population?
So the thing that is different is maybe not the emotion that they're feeling. So again, most people definitely, angry is one that most people recognize more than other emotions, but most people are close to 100% when it comes to all those emotions, right? So when you look at 50, 60, 40, 30%, that's way lower than typical folks. So again, you know, what we know about the Eggman faces is they've been standardized across, you know, people from Africa and people from Europe. Everyone recognizes the same emotion. So they're definitely significantly lower than the general population, that recognition part.
Great. Our next question is, can you recommend some specific resources for working on the skill of identifying emotions?
You know, I haven't really thought about that. I would say that there are a couple of workbooks for folks with autism, and I can look those up, but I think you could probably Google them. It needs to have a real face, so it shouldn't be a comic book, or you know, like it needs to be a real face. But again, it's definitely stuff you can even kind of weirdly do at home. So magazines, anything that has actual faces, you can use those as a springboard. So I would say that there's not a ton out there that's not really geared towards folks with autism. But my thought is folks with PWS are way more socially motivated. So I think it's important to kind of know that they use that as a springboard, but you really probably wouldn't have to do more than a couple weeks work on emotional recognition before you would start to really move to more social skills. So I would say anything that has a face on it, you can use it. You can freeze frame things, with your DVR, whatever else, and focus on facial expressions. It really doesn't have to be anything formal. It can just be real life kind of stuff.
Great. Our next question is, as we're thinking about the benefit of small group and other in-person settings for our kids in the middle of a pandemic, how should we think about masks and how much they will get out of the setting when they cannot see mouths?
That's a great question. Yeah, I will say that when we did it, we were virtual, but you could obviously see it. So I would say that if you're in person, the mask is definitely going to take away some of that information. I will say that I actually bought one of these recently. I bought a pack of the masks that actually have the clear window. They do get a little foggy, which is the downside, and they're a little hotter. But I think it's important for people with PWS to kind of see more of the face. But my thought is right now that the mask wearing is going to make things harder. But if you can find a way to kind of like, if you do Zoom, obviously you don't have to necessarily wear a mask, so you could use that. But I would say if you wear a mask, then I would tell them to really focus specifically on the eye area and the forehead. So, when people are happy or surprised, you get the lines in your forehead, especially if you're my age. It's important to look at those other cues, the wrinkles around the eyes, all those things. We really focused a lot on those other cues that aren't necessarily, so anything below the nose is going to be way harder to see. And then body language. So what are people's hands doing? What is their body doing? How can you look at those other things? So it's really kind of making them very aware. It's almost like if you lose hearing, you have to rely more on other senses to get the information. So for them, if you can't see the mouth, how can we rely on those other cues for more information to help kind of solve it and figure things out?
Great. I know you mentioned putting things on FPWR's website. So someone's asking, will there be future studies?
That's a great idea. Well, we haven't thought about it. What we're hoping is that when we get our curriculum published, that we might be able to have people, use them. I know Australia is one that we've been in touch with them actually long before this happened about getting that information out to them. So because Australia is so gigantic, to find ways to connect people who live kind of far away through BOSS. So, I mean, my thought is probably not studies, but again, if the curriculum's out there, if the format is out there, it's something anybody can do. So I think it's important to kind of know that at this point, we know that it works, and we know it works for people with PWS, and would definitely work for people with other disabilities. So I tell people it doesn't have to be just for PWS, but I think it's the idea of using it and kind of figuring out from your own perspective is, does it help my kid? And our thought is, and it's not for very young kids. So we went down to 13 and up to adulthood. But I think it's really important that some of the skills can be watered down to kids who are younger. But if I have people talking about 4 and 5-year-olds, I'm like, okay, let's focus on maybe some of the more basic stuff, which is turn taking, recognizing emotions, and those kinds of things. We're not gonna, we're not gonna have somebody do really high level stuff at that point. It's gonna be too over their head.
So a follow-up for me to what you just said, then what age would it be appropriate to start a little higher level?
I would say all the way maybe, so the facial recognition and some of the basic stuff can go, I would say go down to like 5 or 6. But then the kinds of more of the scenarios where we actually acted things out, we're definitely more like teenager. So we could go down to maybe 10, but much younger than that, you start to get that gray area. So again, I would focus on, if your kids are younger than 10, turn taking, this idea of participating, compliance, getting along, cooperation, the basic kind of building blocks for social interaction. And then once they get to that, then you can focus more on kind of the role playing, the kind of like problem solving, other skills that are a little bit more higher level. But some kids, even younger kids can do some of these things. So everyone with PWS is an individual. Nothing is, a set thing. We don't know. I think you just kind of see, can they do these things? Are they okay at it? Can they figure it out? And if they can, you could definitely consider using them to kids that may be up to like maybe 6 or 8.
Great. Our next question is, what devices and or tricks do you have to reducing interruptions?
The talking stick is good. So I had a mom who was telling me that she was, in the pandemic time walking with her two children who both have PWS and they wouldn't stop interrupting her. And she said, so the talking stick, even if it's a regular stick that you pick up, can be fine. Be like, I have the stick, I get to talk. So sometimes kids with PWS need a very concrete way to get, whatever. And the interrupting, you don't acknowledge it. Like you literally don't answer their question. If you do, you're inadvertently reinforcing the very behavior you don't want to. So if somebody interrupts you and you answer them, they're like, cool, that's all I need to do to get myself, answered. But the idea of kind of like immediate gratification and not being able to wait is a really important skill. We need people to be able to be more patient, not interrupt others, and find ways to kind of put off the need for their answer. They may be anxious and they may be worried about it, but that doesn't give them the right to interrupt other people. So they have to kind of get that their needs aren't more important than other people. They're the same as other people. And that was like our first basic tenet. You're not more important than other people. And they were like, what? I'm pretty sure I am. And it was like, you're not. So, it's okay to be that concrete. And we found that we had to be that concrete for them to get it.
So our next question is, my son says he is afraid he will forget what he wants to say if he doesn't say the things when he thinks of it. How do you deal with short-term memory issues and back and forth conversations?
Right. I think a lot of times we kind of don't know what is PWS and what is something else. But, we have that happen to us, right? Every day, don't you start to say something and you're like, I was going to ask a really great question and now I can't remember what it is. So I would say that I would tell my son, I too do that, but it's not okay. So again, you can worry about it. If you can write it down so you won't forget it. Do whatever you need to. And it's okay sometimes to say that sometimes even when they come to me, I can't remember the great comment or question I was going to ask because I forgot it. That's okay. That's real life. So I think it's important to get that just because you don't always remember it. So if you can come up with other techniques, writing it, like I said, would be one way. And sometimes to realize that we all do that. It's a thing that happens. So my thought is when people get highly anxious, it's really hard for them to kind of keep it in the moment. So I would just say that, and I'll come back to you. Maybe you'll remember it in a minute. And sometimes they do. So those kinds of things. But it's important to be polite to other people and to do the turn taking because, again, your needs are not more important than other people. Everyone's got something they're dealing with.
So we have two back-to-back questions that came in that are both about autism. I'm going to try to combine them for you. So one of the individuals was saying that you had diagnosed their son about 6 years ago with autism. Has the criteria changed? Should they have him reevaluated? Is there PWS specific criteria? And then the question after that was, can you tell us behaviors that will raise an alarm to parents that we should get them tested?
Okay, that's a good question. So the criteria has not changed. The actual name of it is, so now it's autism spectrum disorder. They're not all these other kinds of subgroups, and for people who have the higher functioning autism, they don't like the fact that they have to be grouped in with all these other people. But that is the only thing that has changed in the last definitely the last 5 years. What has not changed is there is no PWS specific part of autism. They still have to meet the same deficits in social communication and like social skills and then restricted interest. So this idea is that people with PWS, where they often kind of meet criteria, is they have something they're very interested in, they talk about it incessantly, and so and to the kind of detriment of other things. Like they're not interested in other things, they're only interested in this one thing. So those are some of the things that definitely meet criteria for people with PWS. And as far as what I look for, lack of eye contact, the fact that people, I have people who do this frequently. They don't really look at my face. They look kind of at my midsection or whatever else just because they can't quite bring themselves to look at me. So if I meet somebody for the first time in the hallway, and if you've seen me, you all know I kind of walk down the hallway to kind of greet you. If your kid has a hard time looking at my face or other people's faces, I worry about that being a criteria for autism. Again, restricted interest, not having friends, not having reciprocal kind of play where they don't seem to interact with other people. They do a thing and there is a part of the ADOS where we actually play something and then we ask them to join in, and I have people with PWS who go, nope, I don't want to play with you. You can watch me play with the thing. So if they have things where they don't interact and kind of turn take with other people reciprocally, I worry about those things. Not necessarily doesn't mean they have autism, but it's an indicator that we need to be looking at those. And if you've already been diagnosed, generally you don't grow out of autism. When people say, like Jenny McCarthy, well, my kid had autism, but now they don't. Well, probably didn't really have autism, right? So this idea is that if you have autism, just like with PWS, it's a lifelong, condition. And we may get better, but you don't stop having it. So I think it's important to kind of know that we may get people who get better, but they still usually meet the criteria. So I would just say it's not necessarily important unless you think they've changed dramatically in some way. So I would say that would be the one thing. If they've changed dramatically in some way, you could have them reevaluated.
Great. Our next question is, my niece won't focus on Zoom or Team Meetup. She's only 8, but I think she struggles to connect remotely. Any tips to help with this?
That's a great question. I do think it's hard for people sometimes to connect. And I think even for typical people, it's hard to connect. So I would say a one-on-one Zoom session would be better. And I would have the person do the full screen. And I do a background in my screen only because it keeps distractions out, which I find, I have a couple of cats and children who constantly walking behind me. I think it's easier for me to focus on the other person if I can't see what's going on behind me. So I will say, do a background if you can, have them sit really close to the screen so that it feels like it's kind of face to face, and do one person, then 2 people. So you can kind of like make it so that it's the Brady Bunch, right? More tiles for more people. But realize that people with PWS are not, we found that if we got over like 5 or 7 people in a Zoom group, too many to actually have them focus. So once we got past like 7, they weren't really good at that. So 8 is kind of young. And I would look again at finding ways to remove distractions, get them to sit close to the screen, focus one-on-one with the person, and also give them lots of structure. If you're just sitting there chatting on Zoom without structure, they can't do it. So I say, give them an activity, give them a thing to do. It can be play a game, it can be 20 questions, it could be whatever. You're going to have to moderate it because they're not going to be able to do the structure that they need to keep them on task. So no, it's going to be you running Zoom until they get enough skills to actually do it on their own.
Our next question is there a good way to work through losing appropriately? For instance, my child loves to play board games, gets really upset when she loses, so her peers generally don't want to play with her.
Yeah, that's actually a great question too. So the idea is that nobody likes to lose, right? So, and what we did with some of our play acting, Haley and I would be completely unreasonable about something pretty normal, right? And it was so interesting. They were way better at picking those out in us than they were themselves, right? So we would, again, overact a little bit. So I think it's important to point it out in other people, how that feels. And again, whenever your kid gets a certain age, letting them win is not okay. I mean, they may be great at something, but they're not great at everything. Everybody loses at something. So it's important for them to know how that feels. And I always say it's so important to be a gracious loser, but also be a gracious winner. There's like, yeah, in your face, whatever else. You want somebody who's respectful to others. So the idea is that if they're only playing the one game that they're really good at, that they're winning all the time, don't let them do that. Let them play a game they're not going to win at. And basically kind of say, if you want to play with other people, you have to be a good loser. So I would model that, make sure that everyone in your family is modeling that. And I would also let them lose. They need to know what that feels like. And again, point it out in others that nobody likes to see that, somebody who's not a good, loser, and how it feels. So model that behavior, do little kind of baby steps toward get to them, but don't let them play something they're always going to win at, because that's not realistic. And that's certainly not no one wants to play with somebody who they already know is going to win every time.
Our next question is, what to do when my daughter wants to fit in with typical school friends, but they don't seem interested in a friendship with her? She often feels rejected and then gravitates to adults more.
So I don't know her age. And so my thought is depending on her age. So for kids in I would say middle school age, that's where I kind of sometimes see these things happen where kids don't really seem to get them. One of two things. So She can find a way to basically kind of, if she wants to be kind of interact with other kids, couple things: compliment other kids on what they're doing, what they're wearing, kind of fill in the blank of things that she can pick out and say something nice about. That generally tends to get people to go, oh, well, that's, thank you very much, and whatever else. And if at some point she doesn't really seem to fit into that group, and I think as a parent, you kind of have to make that call, right? Is like, if she's not really fitting in, they're talking about something that she is not interested in, or she can't really comment and be a kind of an important part of that group, then I think you find peers who are maybe not typical, who actually she has something that she has in common with. We had several people in Zoom that were really high functioning that basically would pass in any setting as somebody without a disability. I love the fact that those folks actually got something out of interacting with people who were different than them with PWS. I think it's really important for us to kind of see that finding a peer group is a little bit like finding your family, right? You find a group of people that you feel comfortable enough, that you feel good enough. And for people with PWS, I think they have to sometimes feel like they're competent and better than other people, which means that's not always typical kids, right? You want to actually be good at something and talk about the thing that you like and the thing that you're good at. And sometimes typical folks aren't that interested in that. So again, find your group, and they're not always going to be typical peers.
Right. So I'm going to put another two-parter together. So someone had a question. Does true autism diagnosis change your approach with social interactions? And follow up with that, another person had a question. Does the criteria for autism have to be in home and outside? Their example is they have great communication and reciprocal play with a younger brother, but they struggle with peers.
Okay, so I'm gonna answer the last part first because I remember that better, and then I may get you to actually say the part first. So as far, we often find that people, just like when people said like get along better with family, younger brothers, like I said, are great. I mean, they're going to teach you skills and whatever else. My thought is it's just easier to do it with a younger sibling than it is for peers. So what I would do is, again, use it as a springboard. You know how you play with Johnny and you play with whatever? Get them to focus on those kinds of skills. And then with peers, a lot of kids kind of leave others in the dust. They're like, he's not fast enough, or he's not whatever. It takes him a while to get out his words. People can be kind of, mean and also dismissive. So I think if those are the kids your kids are playing with, you might want to actually jettison them and find some kids who are more like peers. And then if you can actually get them to kind of keep up with others, again, they can have one or two funny comments, a joke they can share, something that might kind of, again, bring the group to them. Do that. I just think it does make it harder. And as kids get older, we see those kind of disparities really growing. So I think you have to be aware that as kids get to middle school and high school, it's harder for them to keep up with their peers. So as long as your son has connections, I think that's really important. And as far as treating social skills different, social motivation, I think, is something that's usually a part of autism that's generally not a part of PWS. And I think it's really important to kind of say that if you don't care about other people and you don't want to have friends, it is really hard to teach social skills. If I have nowhere to go, I don't really care if I could drive a car, right? Because it doesn't matter. So I think we had a few people in Boss that actually signed up, definitely had autism as a much bigger criteria than PWS. And they didn't get much out of the group. They didn't participate. We would give them the chance to speak. They didn't really have anything to say. And at the end of it, I kind of asked them after several sessions, I said, do you want to have other friends? Do you feel lonely and want a connection with other people? They said no, they don't really care. Their mom was making them do it. So if they don't care and it's not something they feel like they're missing, I think it's really hard to use exactly something like the Boss or another curriculum that's really, you have to have social motivation in order to get a place. So I think it really depends on your kid. But if they're lonely and they talk about wanting to have friends and they're missing out, then you have to kind of help make those things happen. So it depends on what their needs are and whether they're not getting met or whether they feel like, I got friends. I don't need any more friends. I'm good. It's really hard to make people, get social skills if that's how they feel.
Our next question is, my son was just suspended for 2 days for asking inappropriate questions to another student. How can I help the school understand that suspension is not the answer, but social skills training is perhaps a better way?
That's a great question. Yeah, we find a lot with people with PWS that people just say, oh, we're going to suspend them or we're going to kick them out of school or whatever else. I would, unless the questions were one of two ilk, and there are one or two things that being a former teacher, I can say, if anyone felt threatened in a way, you know, whatever, or sexual, those are the two things that schools tend to take pretty seriously, even on Zoom. So I would tell your kid that, you know, it's not okay to ask those questions. They need to also know that there are consequences. But if they weren't those consequences that made people feel really uncomfortable or unsafe, then I would have the school really focus on the fact that, you know, people with disabilities don't often know that this isn't okay to say. So I would say, and again, right now schools are, you know, barely keeping above water trying to offer, you know, academics at this point. So I would say them offering social skills, probably not going to happen. But as a parent, you could help implement some of those things. And you really do need to tell your kids sometimes that that's not okay to say. I have parents who go, well, and they try to like, they try to like finesse it. I'm like, no, we're real cut and dried about it. I think it's important for kids who say things that are, you know, make people feel really uncomfortable or really unsafe, that it's not okay. And it will keep you from having friends. People with PWS need to know that. So I would have actually kicked them out of Zoom if I were the teacher. I wouldn't have suspended them. I would have said, when you can get it together, you can come back.
Our next question is from a parent of a 5 to 6-year-old. That's what they put. What could I say to the teacher so that they could help their child to be more involved socially in the classroom?
Okay, so if we're talking Zoom, again, I think teachers are pretty much inundated trying to, like, you know, barely manage all the many people they're trying to manage. But I would say turn taking, giving them a chance to respond to a question, throwing them a little softball every once in a while, kind of knowing that this will be something they're very interested in or want to talk about. The other thing they can do is find a way for the student, even at 5 or 6, to have like maybe 30 seconds to a minute to tell the other classmates about something that they really like to do or something that was really fun that they did. Those are ways to really build on social skills for kids who are 5 to 6 years old. What are they going to talk about? How long do they have? An activity that everyone can do, a dance they like to do, really doesn't matter what it is, but somewhere that they get to be the person sharing the information. That those kinds of skills really do build competence, and they build confidence in people with PWS, which is so important for social skills. You have to feel like you're good at it to want to do it.
Any ideas on how to help my 8-year-old son understand that everything isn't about him?
I mean, you know, I feel like a lot of it is just keep reminding him it's not about you. It's not. And again, I do feel like people with PWS are more intense about that, but I do think, you know, it's an important skill to have. And 8 is a great age to really be focusing on those things and say exactly that. It's not mean, it's real. And so I think this idea that we're trying, you know, again, you don't want to hurt their feelings, and it's not about humiliating people, but it's not about you. But when you're 8, you kind of think everything's about you, right? So again, keep saying it, keep making sure you're not reinforcing it by letting them always get to do things first, always, you know, interrupt you, all those things. Make sure you're not doing those things inadvertently, which give the mixed message of you're not always the most important thing, but I treat you like you are. If you want a kid who's going to get along with others, you have to treat them like others, not like they're special.
Any super tips for perseveration? It can be difficult to manage combined with short-term memory, OCD, anxiety, not to mention ASD traits and individual's agenda. I've tried visual aids previously, which helps, but they're exhausting. Repeating instructions, I've also tried, I'm only going to answer this 3 times.
Yeah, so those are the ones we generally say, and then not to answer it. And again, they may be stressed, they may be anxious, they may hate that you do that, but they have to get that they have some responsibility. So write it down, whatever you can do, but you don't always want to give them those, you know, crutches to always lean on. So I would just say not answering, not continuing to talk about a thing, set up a timer so that they can't continue to talk about it. So again, anything you can do, and also know that baby steps will lead you closer to that thing. So, but it is a lot of work to get them not to perseverate. It is such a PWS behavior. And like you said, they definitely have deficits that make those things more likely. But if we can kind of move them towards other kinds of like problem solving, things that they, again, take responsibility for, less effort. So front end, more effort for you, back end, less effort for you. So I think you just have to kind of figure out what works and don't reinforce it.
Can you give some examples of activities or games you play on virtual sessions?
Right. So there are several people have played things like Pictionary. And again, it just depends on the age of the kid. We have kids who've done like kinds of like I Spy, especially if you can see their background. You have to let them know that other people have to be able to see what you can see. So if you can see it on your screen, they can see it behind you. But it can't be something like, that's somewhere else in the room. You could talk about pets. You can, some people play, like I said, there are like a lot of online games. And I'm old enough that I'm thinking of really old games, but there's not much that you can't play. Even things like Hangman and Tic-Tac-Toe, especially if you can share your screen. Anything like that doesn't matter. It literally, a game, the simpler it is and the less materials that it requires, the easier it's going to be. But we've had people, again, do puzzles and do kinds of like, I would call it more like parallel play, but chat while they're doing it. Whatever you can find that they can do. And again, asking questions, if they're a little bit older, some of the games are a little bit more complicated. They can do those, but again, it depends on age and kind of developmental level of the kid.
So this next one is from the same person. It's a two-part question, or a statement and a question. So she says, my daughter worries so much that people will make fun of her. She's 14. And she is also so sure that she does not like someone if they say something that's pretty on point. For example, telling her that her hair is messy or asking her about her doctor's appointments. That didn't have an actual question.
Yeah. Well, so I think 14 is a tough age. So again, focusing on confidence and competence. So the idea of small baby steps and to kind of give people a break, right? We're not perfect. We've actually talked about that in Boss. We're not perfect. We shouldn't expect other people to be perfect. So if somebody else points out something, again, on point that hurts her feelings, I think it's important for her to, focus on, does she ever do that to anyone else? How do you think that makes them feel? So the idea, and again, 14-year-old girls, they're the worst. So I don't know. I just kind of think that maybe you focus on kids who are a little bit younger than you, so they're a little bit, not quite so mean, or you find a group of girls that are nice that will kind of be honest, but not cruel. I mean, there's a fine line, right? So I would just say, if she wants to present her best effort, her hair should be combed. She should look like those things she should do, but then also realize that 14-year-old girls are kind of mean. So it's kind of who they are. So that's kind of my two-part question, but I would also kind of find a group of people who aren't necessarily mean. If some people are mean to your kids, that to me is not okay, but kids that age can be pretty awful.
Would my child's ABA therapy have to adjust if my daughter gets an autism diagnosis?
That's definitely not my specialty. So I don't know. I would definitely just kind of talk to your ABA therapist, but they should really have specific goals in mind that they're focusing on, and then things that are, that we're trying to kind of manage or whatever. So I would say maybe, but it just depends on what exactly they're working on.
This is an in-person school question. So their child is in person right now. They're in first grade. What kind of social skills and goals do we ask for when it comes to their IEP?
So I would focus a lot on, so some small group things, maybe some peer, like kind of matching. So if they can find a peer in their classroom that, the teacher thinks would be a good match for them to do an activity together. So at this point, at that age, you're focused on cooperation, turn taking, being able to kind of get along with others without kind of having to always have it your way. So those are the basic skills I would be focused on. So doesn't matter what it is, just are they working on those skills? So again, if communication and other things get in the way, how can we find a way to really kind of circumvent the maybe deficits they have so that they can kind of maximize it? So again, turn taking, playing a game, recess, anything that they're doing, other kids are they interacting with, and having teachers kind of help them navigate some of the sticky situations. But it's pretty basic at that point, even for typical kids, pretty basic.
Okay, this is our last question. So this person said that they have a 9-year-old with PWS. and their child is always saying, "Mommy, I want you to say that." So she wants the child wants them to repeat the question over and over. And then it sounds like then when she doesn't do it, the child starts getting incredibly frustrated and then wants an apology for not doing it. And she just said, "It never ends. How do I stop this cycle?"
That's actually a great question. So the only thing that's going to end is if you end it as a parent. So I would, before this happens again, I would say, listen, I'm not going to repeat your question. You can add, and again, if it's an articulation, if there's something that's like specifically to like being able to not understand the question, that may be a slightly different response. But if it's just, I want you to say it in a certain intonation and I demand it, you don't. And you let them cry and you let them have a fit and you whatever, and you just go, "I'm really sorry," but and you give them no attention. It will make you very uncomfortable. They will hate it. You will hate it. It is part of the process of doing it over and over until your kid goes, "Oh, wow, she's really not going to do this thing." Yeah, she's really not. My thought is if they're doing it to you and not other people, there's a reason they're doing it to you. Don't be part of the problem, be part of the solution, which is telling your kid, you're not going to do it. And they may get very upset about it and they're going to be okay.
We had one other question pop up. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. It says, "My son will not tell me or talk to me about conversations he's had with anyone, including his father. He's extremely vague. How do I get him to communicate with me? He's 18. I've always told him to never be afraid to talk to me. He has seen her advocate for him with teachers, doctors, and has seen her upset. Do you think that maybe he's afraid that she'll get upset?"
I mean, it's possible. And I would say that sometimes you have to find kind of a neutral thing to talk about that is not though. Like, so if you ask people, then they feel kind of put on the spot, right? And if you have PWS and you're worried your mom might be upset, you basically just evade. So my thought is if he's got pretty good communication skills and he's talking to lots of other people, I would do the old, I mean, I have a 21-year-old and a 23-year-old. And so I do the old, I talk about other people and just kind of see what they say. So I get more information by being indirect than I do by being direct. Like I don't say, "What did you talk to your friend about? And what did you guys do?" or whatever. I do the old, "Hey, and I just talk about something kind of vague and something, whatever, and see if I can get them to respond. And then I try to like find a way. And it's okay at 18 to not necessarily, if he wanted to tell her, I think he would. So my thought is I would figure out what the motivation is. Is it trying to keep something from you, not trying to get you upset? And if that's the case, then don't get upset. I tell people it's very important. If that's the reason they don't tell you, then don't do that thing, because there's a reason they're not going to want to share with you. And you want your kids to be able to talk to you, which means you don't always react. Even if you internally really want to react, don't do it, because you want to kind of get them to feel comfortable. It's like a baby deer. You don't want to scare them. Small steps. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And just get them to actually talk to you. And it can be about something completely unrelated that segues into that.